Can Israel tolerate a Turkish military base inside Syria? At first glance, this might sound like a question about one airfield, but underneath it is a much bigger struggle. Who will control Syria's future? Will Syria become a battlefield between regional powers? Can Turkey expand its military influence without triggering an Israeli response? And perhaps the biggest question, could Syria become the place where two major regional military powers, Turkey and Israel, finally collide directly? In August 2026, Israel carried out airstrikes against the Syrian Abu al-Duhur air base in northwestern Syria. Israel said it was concerned about a possible Turkish military deployment. Turkey rejected the Israeli allegations, and Syria itself said there were no plans for a permanent Turkish military presence at the base. So what is really happening? To understand the confrontation, we first have to understand how dramatically Syria has changed. For more than a decade, Syria was dominated by a devastating civil war. The Assad government controlled Damascus and large portions of the country. Iran and Russia became major military supporters of Assad. Turkey supported opposition forces and maintained military influence in northern Syria. Israel repeatedly attacked targets in Syria, particularly when it believed Iranian weapons, personnel, or infrastructure threatened Israeli security. Then came the dramatic collapse of Bashar al-Assad's government in December 2024. The strategic equation changed. Suddenly, Syria was no longer simply a contest between Assad, Iran, Russia, Turkey, Israel, and various armed groups. A new Syrian leadership emerged, and every regional power had to answer the same question. What will the new Syria look like? Turkey has enormous strategic interests in Syria. There are several reasons. First is security. Turkey shares a long border with Syria. Second is the Kurdish question. Ankara has long viewed certain Kurdish armed groups operating in northern Syria as serious security threats. Third is refugees. Millions of Syrians have fled the country's war, with Turkey hosting a very large Syrian refugee population. And fourth is regional influence. A friendly government in Damascus could fundamentally change Turkey's position in the Middle East. Turkey has already provided military assistance and training to Syria's new authorities. The two countries signed a military cooperation agreement in 2025, according to reporting on their defense relationship. But Turkey's growing role creates a problem for Israel, because Israel sees Syria through a completely different strategic lens. Israel's concern isn't necessarily that Turkey will attack Israel tomorrow. The deeper issue is military infrastructure. Imagine a Syrian air base being rebuilt. Then Turkish personnel arrive. Aircraft potentially operate from the facility. Air defense systems appear. Radar becomes operational. Drones are deployed. Training begins. Suddenly, the military balance inside Syria has changed. Israel has historically tried to maintain military freedom of action in Syrian airspace. That freedom becomes more complicated if another major regional military power establishes a sophisticated military presence. And Turkey isn't a small regional actor. Turkey has a large conventional military, a substantial drone industry, fighter aircraft, air defense systems, and extensive military experience. It is also a NATO member. So from Israel's perspective, a permanent Turkish military infrastructure in Syria could represent a completely new strategic environment. Now we come to Abu al-Duhur. On August 18, 2026, Israel struck the Syrian military airbase. According to Syrian officials, a Turkish delegation had visited the facility shortly before the attack. Israel said it believed Syria was moving toward allowing Turkish forces to deploy there. The strike damaged the facility but reportedly caused no casualties. Turkey condemned the Israeli action, and Syria denied that it was planning to establish a permanent Turkish base there. This distinction is extremely important. There is a difference between Turkish military cooperation with Syria and a permanent Turkish military base in Syria. Those are not necessarily the same thing. Turkey has rejected Israel's allegations. Ankara says its military cooperation with Syria is focused on training, expertise, and helping rebuild Syrian institutions. Turkey has also condemned the Israeli strikes. And this is where the situation becomes complicated. Syria's foreign minister, Asad al-Shaibani, recently said Turkish military officials had visited Abu al-Duhur for training and military cooperation, but he simultaneously denied plans for a Turkish military buildup there. He said the facility was largely empty, so there are competing narratives. Israel says, "We saw a potential military threat." Turkey says, "Those allegations are unacceptable." Syria says, "There was no plan for a permanent Turkish base." And Washington says, "We need a mechanism to prevent this from escalating." Israel has increasingly made clear that it does not intend to accept unlimited foreign military expansion in Syria. This isn't entirely new. In 2025, Israel also struck Syrian military facilities that were reportedly being considered for Turkish use. Reuters reported at the time that Israel attacked the T4 airbase and facilities in Hama and Homs amid concerns over Turkish military ambitions in Syria. Israeli officials described the strikes as a warning that Israel would not allow Syrian developments to threaten its security. So the current crisis did not emerge from nowhere. It is part of a developing pattern. Israel sees the Syrian military landscape changing. Turkey sees an opportunity to strengthen Syria, and both countries believe their national security interests are at stake. Here's the key question. Can Israel actually prevent Turkey from establishing a base in Syria? Not necessarily. Israel can use military power to destroy infrastructure. But destroying a runway does not necessarily stop a determined government. Turkey could potentially help rebuild facilities. It could provide equipment elsewhere. It could expand training missions. It could use other Syrian bases. Or it could negotiate an arrangement with Damascus that makes its presence politically legitimate. And this is the crucial point. Syria is a sovereign country. If the Syrian government legally invites Turkish forces, Israel cannot simply decide that Turkey has no right to be there. But Israel can decide that such a deployment creates a security threat and respond militarily. That is exactly where the danger lies. A direct Israeli-Turkish military confrontation would be extraordinarily dangerous. Turkey is a NATO member. Israel has a close strategic relationship with the United States. That doesn't mean NATO would automatically go to war for Turkey in a confrontation with Israel, but it creates an enormous diplomatic problem for Washington. The United States would be dealing with two strategically important partners, and Syria would be sitting directly between them. This is why Washington has already been pushing for a deconfliction mechanism. U.S. Special Envoy Tom Barrack has said Washington is working toward a communications framework involving Turkey, Israel, and Syria to prevent misunderstandings from turning into a larger confrontation. There are at least three possible scenarios. Scenario 1. De-escalation. Turkey and Israel agree on limits. Turkey continues helping Syria militarily but does not establish major offensive infrastructure close to Israel. Israel reduces strikes. Washington helps establish communication channels. This is probably the least dangerous outcome. Scenario 2. Turkish military expansion. Turkey gradually increases its presence. More trainers arrive. Air bases are rebuilt. Air defense systems appear. Turkey becomes the dominant external military power supporting Damascus. Israel responds with additional strikes. This could produce a long-term confrontation. Scenario 3. Direct confrontation. A Turkish aircraft or military installation is attacked. Turkey retaliates. Israel responds. Suddenly, the conflict is no longer about Syria. It becomes an Israel-Turkey crisis. And that is the scenario Washington desperately wants to prevent. If the contest remains primarily about air power, Israel has major advantages in intelligence, surveillance, precision strike capabilities, and combat experience. Turkey, however, has geographical advantages. Turkey borders Syria. That means Turkish forces can be supplied over land far more easily than forces operating from distant countries. Turkey also has significant military infrastructure and a large defense industry. So this isn't a simple question of who has the stronger military. The real question is, who can sustain influence inside Syria at acceptable political and military cost? And that is much harder to answer. The question isn't simply, will Israel allow Turkey to build a base in Syria? The bigger question is, who gets to shape the future security architecture of Syria? Turkey wants a stable Syria aligned with its interests. Israel wants a Syria that cannot become a platform for threats against Israel. Syria wants to rebuild its military and sovereignty. And the United States wants to prevent its regional partners from going to war with each other. For now, the situation remains fluid. Syria says there is no plan for a permanent Turkish base at Abu al-Duhur. Turkey rejects Israel's allegations. Israel has demonstrated that it is willing to use force to prevent what it considers a dangerous military development. And Washington is trying to put communication channels between the three countries before another incident turns into something much bigger. The runway at Abu al-Duhur may be damaged, but the larger strategic contest over Syria has only just begun. And if Turkey and Israel cannot agree on where their red lines end, Syria could become the battlefield where those red lines collide. Subscribe for more deep dive geopolitical documentaries.